It began with silence, the kind of silence that lingers heavy after tragedy. When her husband was murdered, left bleeding in the street by men who thought themselves untouchable, she did not cry in public. She did not collapse or plead for justice that would never come. She stood at the graveside in black, her face carved into stillness, her fingers tightening on the folds of her dress, and in that moment, she swore something that only she could hear. Vows made in silence are the hardest to break, and hers was made of iron. They would pay. Every last one of them. She had never been part of that world. Her husband had kept her away from it, even as he brushed shoulders with people who lived in its shadows. He had been a good man in the wrong place at the wrong time, killed because he witnessed something he should not have seen. The police offered her sympathy and empty words, but no one dared touch the men who had ordered his death. They were protected by layers of fear and loyalty, by money that bought silence, and by blood ties that no outsider could break. But she was not just an outsider anymore. She was a widow, stripped of fear, hollowed out by grief, and filled with only one thing: vengeance. Her plan was not rushed. She knew rage was a weapon that burned hot and fast, and if she swung it blindly, it would consume her. So she became patient. She started with observation. She sat quietly in the corners of bars, walked through markets where whispers traded faster than goods, and listened. She was unremarkable, just another grieving woman dressed in black. No one noticed her, and that was her greatest advantage. She learned their routines, the leaders and the soldiers, the corrupt officials who turned away, the fronts they used for laundering money. Names collected like stones in her pocket, heavy and unrelenting. The first move she made was small, a strike no one could trace. One of their couriers went missing on his route, his satchel of money disappearing with him. Rumors said it was a rival gang. She spread those rumors herself, planting seeds of distrust. Soon, the network began to fracture, its men looking over their shoulders, questioning their allies. She had no army, no weapons beyond cunning and patience, but she had the one thing they lacked: the ability to wait in the dark. Her strikes grew bolder. She exposed one lieutenant's hidden stash of drugs to the police, wrapped neatly in brown paper with his fingerprints all over it. Another's mistress received photographs of his betrayals. A third found his accounts drained after she befriended his accountant, a lonely man eager to talk after a few drinks. She struck where it hurt most: their pride, their wallets, their trust. Each downfall was orchestrated carefully, each move hidden behind layers of misdirection. They fought shadows, thinking their enemies were rivals, never suspecting the widow in black. Yet vengeance is never clean. She saw the blood that followed her actions, heard of men shot in alleys, families fleeing in fear, alliances breaking with violence. But she did not falter. The deeper she went, the more she realized what her husband's death truly meant, that this network thrived on the suffering of others, feeding off fear like a parasite. Her vengeance had grown beyond her grief. It had become justice. At last, she reached the head of the serpent, the man who had ordered her husband's death. He was a name whispered with dread, a figure surrounded by guards and layers of loyalty. To reach him, she had to become someone else entirely. She disguised herself as a courier, carried packages no one dared question, and made herself invisible within their system. For months, she was a ghost among them, until one night, she stood in his mansion, quiet as a shadow. He never expected her. Men like him never did. He thought danger came with guns and noise, not with a widow who had sharpened her grief into a blade. The confrontation was brief. She did not scream or curse. She simply told him her husband's name, the name he had likely forgotten, and then she ended him in silence. By the time the police arrived, tipped off by anonymous calls she had planted in advance, the network was already in ruins. Files, money trails, and names had been delivered to the authorities in neat packages, exposing the entire operation. The empire collapsed overnight, leaving ashes where power once stood. And she, the widow who had started as nothing more than a grieving shadow, vanished from sight. Some say she disappeared into another city, living quietly with a new name. Others whisper she still walks the streets, watching for the rise of another empire built on blood. What remained certain was this: the network that thought itself untouchable had been undone, not by rivals or the law, but by a woman who had nothing left to lose and everything to avenge. Her vengeance was patient, methodical, merciless. And in the end, the widow became a legend, a warning whispered in the underworld that even shadows can kill. In the weeks after the fall of the crime lord, the widow did not feel the peace she thought would come. Justice, she realized, was never as clean as the fantasy of revenge promised. His death had been only the final move in a game she had played for months, but the echoes of it rippled outward. There were still men loyal to him, fractured remnants of the network, scrambling to seize control of the ashes. Power, she knew, never truly died. It shifted, it adapted, it sought a new master. She watched from the shadows as smaller gangs began to circle, each one trying to carve out a piece of the empire she had dismantled. Some were brutal, feeding on the chaos, while others were cautious, waiting to see who would emerge strongest. The widow understood then that her fight was not finished. If she walked away now, her husband's death would simply be avenged, but countless others would fall beneath the next kingpin who rose from the ruins. So she stayed in the game. She learned to wear masks, slipping into roles like a skilled actress. To the broken remnants of the gang, she appeared as a quiet ally, someone who could move money, arrange deals, connect them with outsiders. To the police, she was a nameless informant, feeding them trails that seemed too precise to ignore. To the street-level hustlers, she was nothing more than a faceless whisper in the crowd. No one suspected that the same widow who had buried her husband now pulled strings in the dark. But vengeance had changed her. The grief that had driven her at first had cooled into something sharper, something almost cold. She found herself calculating risks with precision, discarding pity when it got in the way. The first time she saw one of the lieutenants begging for mercy, on his knees as rivals closed in, she did nothing. He had laughed the night her husband was killed. She let them finish him. Her legend grew quietly. People in the underworld began to speak of a phantom, a figure who could never be seen but who knew everything. Deals collapsed without explanation, caches of weapons vanished, and police raids struck at just the right moment. The men still loyal to the old crime boss began to whisper that the devil himself had cursed them. But she was no devil, just a widow who had learned to wield silence like a blade. Months bled into years, and her vengeance evolved into something larger than herself. She was no longer avenging only her husband. She was dismantling a system that thrived on fear, one string at a time. She built networks of her own, not of criminals, but of people who had been broken by them. Mothers who had lost sons, shopkeepers extorted until they had nothing left, young men who wanted out of the life but had no one to trust. She gave them direction, purpose, and, in time, loyalty. The widow, once powerless, had become the head of something new. Not a gang, not a syndicate, but an invisible resistance that struck only when necessary. They called her La Viuda in whispers, the widow. To the underworld, she was a specter of vengeance. To the broken and the fearful, she was hope. But she knew the danger of what she had built. She had seen how power poisoned even the noblest intentions. That was her greatest fear, that one day she might become the very thing she had sworn to destroy. And so she fought not only criminals but also herself, walking a thin line between justice and corruption. And yet, every time doubt crept in, she remembered her husband's face on that cold night, the life stolen from him for nothing more than being in the wrong place. That memory was her anchor, her reminder that she was not seeking glory or power. She was seeking balance. She was giving the dead a voice, and the living a chance to breathe without fear. The widow's story did not end with the death of one man. It unfolded in shadows, in whispered names and vanished empires, in police files marked anonymous source, and in graves dug quietly in forgotten corners. She became a legend not because she burned bright, but because she endured, year after year, unseen but unstoppable. And so, when the underworld spoke of her, it was never with certainty. Was she real? Was she just a story mothers told their children to scare them from crime? Or was she still out there, a woman in black who watched from the dark, waiting to strike? The truth was both simpler and more terrifying. She was real. She was patient. And she was not done. Her world grew larger as the years stretched on. What had begun as a vendetta born from grief had become a vast, hidden empire of its own. Not an empire of fear and cruelty, but of quiet power. Still, power is a double-edged sword, and she felt its weight pressing harder with each decision she made. The widow became a strategist, her mind sharper than any blade. She knew which rivals to let rise and which to crush early, allowing chaos to devour itself before stepping in to clean the remains. Rival factions, too busy killing one another, never realized they were being guided toward destruction. She funded raids without her name ever being mentioned, slipped evidence to journalists who thought they had uncovered truths on their own, and slowly dismantled the roots of the network until nothing of the old order remained. But the underworld never truly vanished. For every head she severed, two more tried to grow. One evening, while sitting alone in her quiet flat, she realized that vengeance had long ago stopped being about her husband's death. His face still lived in her memory, his smile, his warmth, but the fire inside her burned for something larger now. She was no longer simply a widow avenging her loss. She was a force balancing scales the world had let tip too far. And yet, her solitude was her punishment. The deeper she sank into the war against crime, the farther she drifted from ordinary life. There were no friends to call, no family dinners, no gentle moments of laughter. She could never reveal her true self to anyone. The people who worked with her knew her only as La Viuda, a myth, a shadow that gave orders through coded messages or distant intermediaries. In truth, she was a woman haunted by silence, sitting night after night in dim rooms, plotting the downfall of men she had never met. One night, she received word that a new figure had entered the scene, a young, ambitious man with more cruelty than cunning. He called himself a visionary, but in truth, he was reckless. He had already begun carving his place in the underworld with unnecessary violence, leaving bodies in alleys and instilling terror, even in children. The widow understood that this kind of chaos, if left unchecked, would unravel everything she had built. She studied him the way she studied all her enemies. She learned about his childhood, his weaknesses, the people he loved in secret. She discovered that his sister, a quiet woman who lived far away from his violence, was the only person who could soften him. For weeks, the widow debated whether to use that knowledge. The old her would have done it without hesitation, but now she questioned herself. Was she becoming a monster, using innocence as weapons? Or was she preventing greater suffering by striking preemptively? Her answer came when the man ordered the burning of an entire block of shops, people she had sworn to protect. That night, the widow abandoned her hesitation. She orchestrated his fall with precision, ensuring his allies betrayed him, his funds disappeared, and his own men turned against him. When he finally stood before her, bound, beaten, and raging, she looked into his eyes and saw not only cruelty, but also the ghost of what her husband's killers had once been. She gave him no speeches, no chance for redemption. She ended him as she had ended the first, swiftly and without hesitation. But afterward, as the silence fell heavy in the room, she felt the faintest crack in her armor. Was she fighting evil, or becoming it? Her followers, those broken souls she had gathered along the way, began to revere her more openly. To them, she was a savior, a protector who delivered them from the men who had crushed their lives. But reverence is dangerous. It was the same reverence that had once built crime lords into untouchable gods. She saw the devotion in their eyes and feared it. If she let it grow, if she allowed herself to believe she was more than human, she would become the very tyrant she despised. So, she kept herself in the shadows. Orders came anonymously, victories went unclaimed. She did not allow her name, her face, or her presence to define the resistance she had built. She wanted the idea to live, not her. Ideas could not be killed the way people could. And yet, in the dead of night, when the city slept and her war paused for just a breath, she sometimes let herself dream of escape. She imagined a quiet home by the sea, where no one knew her name, where her husband's memory lived not in vengeance, but in peace. But every time she came close to walking away, another name, another victim, another injustice pulled her back into the darkness. She was no longer just a widow. She was the balance between chaos and order. She was both feared and depended upon. She was the hand unseen, the whisper in the dark, the shadow that criminals dreaded. And so, her war continued, not because she could not stop, but because the world would not let her.